Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to the secret episode of Fire Emblem Unit Stonks, where I go over these units and discuss how they're doing throughout their whole game, but using a fancy graph instead. Before we get into the graphs though, I want to make a sincere apology to everyone whose name is on this list right here, because these are my patrons that submit these characters, and I did all the other ones up here, and I completely forgot to do the third episode. Like, I have a vague memory, like a Bernstein Beers level memory of actually recording this episode. Maybe one time I started it and I decided I wasn't happy with it and I deleted it. Maybe that's it. But either way, I never released this third episode. It was ages ago. I think it was like February where I recorded all the other ones. So I'm really sorry to everyone on here, and I thank you so much for supporting me. If this ever happens again, please feel free to remind me. It's not rude or anything. Sometimes things just slip my mind, and in this case I completely forgot to record this episode, so here you go. So today we're talking about Marth and Wolf from FE11 Shadow Dragon. We're talking about Ogma and Caeda, as well as Sedgar. We're going to talk about New Mystery of the Emblem with Luke and Catria. We're talking about Chrom from Awakening, Mozu from Conquest, Celica, Luthier, and Alm from Shadows of Valentia, and of course in Three Houses we have the Do, Dorothea, and Leonard. Thanks everyone for submitting, and I apologize for the wait. Let's get into it. Alright, so we're going to start off with Marth, submitted by Boots42. And Marth, I did the lore tier list somewhat recently, so you might remember me kind of memeing on FE11 Marth, because he's not very good in a tier list kind of sense. There isn't really a chapter where I would say Marth is even close to your best unit. There's a couple chapters where I think he is semi-viable. I had the good fortune of having a RNG blessed Marth in early Shadow Dragon, and even that one didn't really last very long, and if he's just going according to his averages, it doesn't do very much. You can see he's like, I gave him sort of decent ratings for the early game because this is before you get the prep screen. I think you get in chapter 4, so like a 6 for chapter 1, and then after that like a 2 or a 3. Marth doesn't get one shot or anything. There's not many enemies that double him besides thieves, so I think most enemies he will survive like one hit, which can be enough. Might even be convenient to bait away enemies, but as the game goes on, it becomes more and more apparent that he just falls behind on his peers because they can reclass, and it didn't give Marth a reclass or even promotion for that matter. He gets the Falchion, but honestly the Falchion isn't very good. The fact that Marth gets one-handed by Medius, even if he has the Falchion, is just kind of sad. So even for the final chapter, I didn't really give him a higher rating than this. I think he's much better in FE3 or FE1 or even FE12. And I think that's pretty clear. Like, he doesn't change much throughout the games. The whole fun of like unit stonks, in my opinion, is when a unit becomes really good, or becomes significantly better due to a promotion or a new option opening up or a new weapon, something like that. Marth doesn't really have that, so his curve is not entirely flat. It has like a bit of a spike in chapter 6. I think it's because it's an indoor chapter, and like the rapier is more effective against certain things. I think that might be it. I guess technically you could give Marth a slight boost in chapter 4. Because technically you get the option for the Forged Rapier. You could do that. The problem is the Forged Rapier has such a big opportunity cost. I'm not sure if it's fair to give Marth a bunch of credit for that option. I also don't know if it's fair to not credit him at all, because it is something that makes him better that other people don't really have an option for. Like, what's the alternative to that? It's like, do we give Ogma a boost for being able to forge the Armor Slayer to be more effective? I don't know about that. Resource use is always kind of weird in unit stonks. But I think overall, the rating for Marth kind of checks out. Boots42 also submitted Wolf. A and S tier patrons get to submit 2 characters instead of 1, so Boots had to wait twice as long for his submissions. Anyway, here's Wolf, and Wolf is one of those characters that has a really big power spike. But the thing about Wolf's power spike, I mean, he has really good growth and then a really high base level and really poor bases. So I gave him like a 4 to start out with in his joiner chapter, a 5 in the next one. He's like some options. It also has really trash weapon ranks, so the usual way you would compensate for bad stats, like, say, mid-late game Jagan, you kind of make him useful through forged weapons. You can't really make use of that with Wolf besides forged iron bows, because he has, like, D and E ranks and everything. So what are you supposed to do? But he does have access to promoted classes, so he's not completely helpless. He's actually sort of helpful to have around, even with his bases in chapter 6 and 7. But after that, you've just got to get those level ups. Now, for these stonks, I assumed he gets his power spike here between chapter 8 and chapter 9, because chapter 8 is one of the easier chapters to raise him. You can do it in I think 7 as well. Basically, it just comes down to plop Wolf on a fort surrounded by cavalry reinforcements and have him level up. You can do that in both the Minerva White Wing chapter and in the port chapter with Rad and Caesar. Both of those are good for that. I assumed you'd do it here. It's not really an efficient way of using him. obviously not. But if you didn't do this, if you make Wolf more of a gradual raising project, I don't know when exactly he'll become good. I don't know how feasible it is to keep feeding Wolf without that method. It'd probably be more of a gradual curve that goes up. Like Wolf is the red line. You can see the big spike is like over here. And then kind of flattens out at a 9 out of 10. I think it's generally fair to say that Caeda will always be better than Sedgar and Wolf, even though she's much less durable. So I had to have someone above them. Like a reminder, 10 means you're the best unit in a certain chapter. So yeah, there you go. I guess I didn't do a very good job of explaining what exactly unit Stonks is, but it's pretty clear from the video. I've not watched the first episodes or so. Anyway, Wolf is really good. He's like obviously becomes super tanky and hard to kill for physical enemies, and even magical enemies. They have like to get through his huge pool of HP. You can use your pure water to augment it a bit if you need to. So Wolf and Sedgar can just carry hard 5 by themselves, but for a more efficiency leading kind of list, their ratings would probably be lower. I'm not super strict with those ratings here because I think it's more fun to make Stonks that go up and down, you know, rather than a slope that just goes up or down. But yeah, that's what I think of Wolf. Nothing really stands out as a chapter where they're like are really good besides this little spike right here. And honestly, might as well cover Jacob's submission of Sedgar here because Sedgar and Wolf are 99% the same units. They have their subtle differences, but the way they work is roughly the same. Generals to tank just about anything, and if they have them with defense, you could switch them to hero and make them double stuff. You do reset their weapon ranks by doing that because you have to go with swords and axes rather than lances and bows, so sometimes it might be worth it to just stick with general or even another class. But generally this is how they would function, how I assume they would function. So the same power spike here. Sedgar's like slightly higher ratings because I think his defense growth is higher, so he gets to that point of no return sooner, where enemies just don't damage him a little sooner. But Wolf is still perfectly viable, and he has better strength and I think a lower base level, so not actually sure which one of these two is better overall, but I think Sedgar has a better early game. Alright, Grey Fox 83 has a submission of Ogma I need to talk about. I think Ogma is very interesting and a great show in unit Stonks. He's the yellow line. You can see he starts at like a 10 out of 10 because I try to think of a unit better than Ogma, and I think the only one that like even comes close is Barst. And I'm talking about purely about his joining chapter and the chapter thereafter, because Ogma is one of the few player units who can double enemies and has a semi-good chance to dodge them, and he's also pretty good against the bosses compared to the other units. He like doesn't get doubled, has good accuracy, and in chapter 3 you can use the killing edge as well. It's really solid compared to everyone else. He's one of your best units. He's like, I don't know if I call him better than Jagan, but he's definitely up there. He's crucial. Like between him and Jagan, like who else even good? Like even Caeda isn't very good at this point. Ogma really stands out, but this is all due to mercenary bases, like the class mercenary, and then his sword rank combined. And when you get to chapter 4, turns out this class actually isn't that good. And also chapter 4 is when enemies shift from being axe-based to being lance-based, and Ogma just loses all sorts of advantages like his high hit rate, his ability to dodge things sometimes. You know, he uses his +1 attack from the sea swords, everything basically just comes crashing down. Ogma, I think he still stays viable. It's been a while since I've played with him. He's one of those units that I think you would really like in Shadow Dragon if you don't do reclassing. But if you do, he actually becomes a lot worse. But a lot of people don't play with reclassing, and I don't blame them because I think it makes units a bit more generic. And if you don't reclass units out of their intended class, then Ogma looks pretty fine because, you know, the hero is a pretty solid class overall. It has 8 move and swords and axes to work with, and a high speed base so they can double things. And you know, speed is one of the most important stats, if not the most important stat in the game. So Ogma works pretty well in that regard. So I never give him below a 6. You could argue he's actually worse than this, comparatively speaking, but generally I think it holds up. Like roughly the curve, it kind of holds up. So like it starts really good, one of the best units, and then he falls down quite a bit. You'll notice I'm not really going into detail on like the whole game, like their whole playthrough, because there's a lot of units to go through. I don't want these to be super long. I only want them to be a little bit long. And in addition, you know, it's just kind of not this is like what tier lists are for, or like waifus or in deep analysis or something. This is just, you know, chill. This is how he flows throughout the whole game. I don't really want to go in depth on every single chapter. But if there's like a single chapter that really jumps out in utility, I'm going to mention it, of course. But I don't think there's such a chapter for Ogma besides the first 2. Then finally, we have peeved submission of course, Caeda. He'll submit Caeda on everything I make, honestly. So Caeda has a bit of a weird thing going on here. She starts like kind of okay, and then she falls off a bit, and then she becomes really good. Coincidentally, when we start getting the Forge, I wonder why. And then she just stays at a 9 or even goes to a 10. So here's the reasoning behind that curve. I'm sure you already know, but I'm going to repeat it anyway because I think that's why people listen to these. She starts out okay. You think she might be worse than this because her combat really isn't that good early on. Like pirates, how good do you expect Caeda to be against pirates that 2-shot her and she can barely do anything damage back at... Like, I think she doubles, but not for a lot of damage, not with high hit rates. But she can distract enemies to make them go elsewhere. And Chapter 2 has a couple of Cavaliers she can kill with a Wing Spear. And, you know, generally, just flying allows you to do things if you're smart. I'm not very smart, so I don't know very well how to make her do things, but I've seen Don make her do things, even though her combat isn't very good. So that's how I know I'm correct, because I just copy what Don does. But seriously, baiting pirates away over the water so that they don't attack your units, so you can instead fight them, have them fight other units, so you don't have to fight more pirates at once. That's helpful. It's not perfect, it's not as good as Jagan, not as good as Ogma, but it's pretty good. Chapter 3, I don't think she should really do anything in that chapter, or should do anything besides maybe fighting 1 or 2 thieves and recruiting Nafar. Anything else is probably pretty dangerous for her because it's almost all fighters and bow users. So, didn't really give her a fire high rating for so far. Also, no real bait to do like in chapters 1 and 2. And in chapter 4, you get the preps menu, you get reclass. You don't really want to reclass Caeda, but you do want to make a forge for her. So this is when you forge the Rider's, not the Rider's Bane. I mean, you forge that too, but for her, it's the Wing Spear. And then she starts one-shotting enemy Cavaliers. It's the best forge, probably in Fire Emblem ever. And the only reason she's not getting a 10... why is she not getting a 10 anyway? I'm trying to think of like better use than Caeda at this point. Because, I mean, Burst? Maybe combat-wise? Possibly? Maybe she shares the 9. I've heard a theory about someone once, because the way I do these is I pick one unit that's the best for every chapter. I give him a 10, and then everyone else below that, I see like how far below are the best are they. Like, it's a rough estimate. And someone brought up in the comments, very rightfully brought up comment, maybe not every unit has a character worth a 10 out of 10. Think of like Radiant Dawn, chapter 1 or something, or even Prologue. Edward, he's the best unit you have there, but he might not be worth a 10. Maybe you just have an 8 out of 10, and a 7 out of 10, and a 6 out of 10 for Edward, Leonardo, and Mekkah. Maybe that's a good way to look at it, but it's not how I did these. But that's how I'm looking at these here, in this one. I think actually in one of the later ones, I actually applied it differently, because it's my video. I could do whatever I want with my standards. But yeah, see, that's really good. But I didn't give her a 10 out of 10 because she still had to promote. I wanted to represent this Pirate Spike somewhere. And promotion is so good that I thought it was worth it. So chapter 10 is when you obtain the Furry Master Seal. You can give it to her in chapter 11, roughly. And then she has, I believe it's 10 move and still Forge Wing Spear, but she also gained a huge boost in all stats she's bad in. Bad. Strength, defense, some HP as well, I believe. Loses a bunch of res, but who cares? You generally need defense more than you need res. So then she becomes strong, bulky, and fast. Not like super bulky, but a lot more defensive. Also gets axes, I guess, and you can reclass it to Paladin now. Lose the bow weakness, keep the lance rank and eye movement. Occasionally that is helpful, like in the Ballista chapter. I forgot if that's, I think it's 15. But if it's not, whatever, you know the chapter I mean. So she's pretty good there. The only chapter I didn't give her a 10 for out of here is the final, because in that one, I think she can one-round the Manakee in front of Medius if you reclass her to Swordmaster, but it's not as good as being like the ultimate boss killer and the ultimate, you know, certain enemy type killer, so I gave her a 9 instead. The 10 would probably go to like Nagi or like a Warp User or something. That's probably how I would do it. But yeah, that's Caeda for you. Really good. And we kind of already went over Sedgar. Seawolf, would basically how I put it. Like, I can go elaborate on the differences, but I think I already did. So, they're basically the same unit. Anyway, let's move on to New Mystery. Alright, so here's New Mystery of Who Balanced Pala. And Vala Agenda, or the Vala Agenda, hope you're doing well, has submitted Luke and Catria. And funnily enough, they both end up following a similar slope, a similar curve. I don't know statistical terms at all, I just make the graphs. And I thought it was interesting because I don't really think they're very alike. I think most people agree that Catria is one of the best units in the game, only beaten by a couple of others like Pala and Chris. And Luke is like, it's that unit that I always think of as like the most average viable unit, like the unit that almost everyone who's played New Mystery on higher difficulties likes, but no one's really like super stoked about, because he's just like, I think Don mentioned it in our tier list review, he's always just, he needs to be dead on his average to reach like doubling thresholds or 1-round KO thresholds or survive enough. He's like always good. The chapter 0 is for the prologue. I just gave him a 6 overall for the prologue, because I think that part really exemplifies Luke in my opinion. You don't really need Luke for a whole lot, except the prologue is so intense in higher difficulties that you need someone to finish off enemies. But it's not that Luke is super helpful in the prologue for setting up those kills. It's just he's the best candidate for taking them, like taking those kills and getting experience, because he doesn't want to take a counter. Someone like Ryan or someone like Merrick, they can afford to attack at 1 range, or at 2 range, actually. Someone like Chris can afford to attack at 1 range and take a counter. So they can set up the kill for Luke, and then Luke can finish him off. And this is kind of how it goes. It's not because Luke is spectacular or anything, but it's because he's one of the worst 1-range units you have. He's not Ogma, he's not Athena, but he can finish off enemies, and he can do that pretty well. Sometimes I think you don't even field him, because there's just no room for him in your deployment. He is okay, but you know, he's just kind of there. He's not really helping the others, other than the fact that he's removing enemies from the fields that would otherwise attack you. And in the process, he gets experience. So he benefits from someone like Ryan setting up kills for him. Even though Ryan has the more standout trait in here. He's the archer. He's setting up the kill for him. If you reverse the order of attacking, if you attack with Luke first, Luke takes a bunch of damage and Ryan finishes off. Ryan is honestly better off, not worse, but Luke is worse off. So Luke is profiting from Ryan here. Kind of mean of Luke. That's kind of the way he works in prologue, I find. In higher difficulties. Lower difficulties, he can get kills by himself just fine. Or with like less help at least. And I think that's kind of the way it flows for the rest of the game too, but it becomes a bit more self-sufficient. Of course, in FE12, it's very hard to judge a character, I find, because everyone can reclass into like everything, especially if they're male, like Luke. So he can go from like a mercenary stroke master kind of class to something like a not a bow knight. Is it called ranger in this one? Horseman, there we go. They always have different names. Horseman, you can do that pretty well. You can do Drakewood Knight, I think, if you get his lance rank up. Like, you can do just about anything you want to. You do have to dedicate to it a bit. I think you don't really want to train his bow rank for the entire game and then go with a lance-based class or something like that. But as long as you're somewhat conscious of your choice, you can make him work. I don't think he changes a whole lot. Like, at some point he'll promote. Sure, at some point he'll get a promotion, like probably around chapter 7 or chapter 8 is when you want to promote most units. If not, it'll be like around chapter 10 instead, depending on what you want. Promoting is a big deal for Luke and honestly every unit in this game, because promotion bonuses are huge. And in Luke's case, when he's unpromoted, he can't fly. He can't be a Pegasus Knight or a Wyvern Rider, because, you know, Draco Knight is the only Wyvern class and is promoted only. So when he promotes, he gets access to that, which I think is a pretty big deal for lance-based units. But even if you just want to go Swordmaster, it's still a big deal. But I find it hard to like credit him for this in this chart, because sure, he promotes, but so does everyone else besides like Aaron and Sirius and other pre-promotes. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to make him stand out more, unless you did it for everyone but the pre-promotes, which I think would make the most sense. But I think for now, when we have a chart with just unpromoted units that promote at some point, I think this makes more sense. But I might adjust it later. You can tell by the chart, it's a bunch of 7s. Like, I don't really have a lot of experience from Luke, but from what I can tell, he doesn't really change a whole lot of utility. Like, sure, he can theoretically use like a Forged Dragon Pike to be better in the Henri's Way arc, the part where you fight a bunch of dragons. But again, so can almost everyone else, so does it really boost Luke? I guess there's characters that don't get this boost, but even like dedicated bow users, they are effective against like flying dragons, so they're the same. And then magic users get to use Excalibur against flying dragons. So again, is it really a boost for Luke if you gain an option of effective weaponry somewhere? I think Luke is fine for the whole game. I just think there's always better characters and always worse characters. So I think a 7 kind of reflects that. That's the way I see it. I still have to replay New Mysteries at some point. This is where I'll give a shout out to Keb, who is making that Blind Lunatic LTC, which seems really crazy. He's doing voice commentary now. I shouted him out on a Monday. And you should really watch his playthrough if you want, because I think if anything is going to make me return to FE12 as a game, it's going to be that playthrough and his explanation of AI, because FE12 higher difficulties, from what I've been told and from what I can see, is all about AI manipulation. If you don't know how to or don't enjoy AI manipulation, the game is just not fun on higher difficulties. And so I've started like 5 different playthroughs on FE12, hard 2 or higher, and I haven't finished or enjoyed a single one of them, not in the end. Like, I've enjoyed parts of it, but I can't really stick to it. That's my experience been with my latest FE12 adventures. Hard 1 I enjoy just fine, but hard 2 and above, I just get a headache trying to plan it out and trying to iron my way through it. So that's why I don't enjoy the games very much right now. So I hope I'll get to enjoy it a bit more in the future. Anyway, Catria, to wrap this up, is I mean, she's just, I don't want to say better Luke, because that sounds like a cop-out, but she's like insane growths and then flyer utility early on, and honestly better bases as well. She doesn't have prologue utility, I guess, but like I said, Luke in the prologue isn't really contributing much, as he's being there and feeding himself kills more than anything, and like finishing off enemies that others don't have the time to finish. He fills a deployment slot, is really what Luke does. But Catria actually contributes to like every map that she's in. She's great. I don't want to say she's spectacular early on. She's definitely more feeding herself than she's really doing utility, but she still does some utility. So still gave her like 7-4 during chapter, 7-4 chapter 3, even though that's more the Pala and Chris show. And after that, she just kind of rapidly goes up in utility. Probably promotes around this same here point here, around like chapter 7, chapter 8, roughly speaking. And then she's just really good. Her growths are outstanding. She caps like a bunch of different stats. She's really, really powerful. But she flies before promotion, unlike Luke, so she's better than that. I think in the end game, it's possible to argue that Luke and Catria should be close to each other than the 7 and the 9 I gave him here, or the 7 and 8 I gave him here. Because Luke probably caps some stats too. I think his growths are good enough to do that. I haven't actually checked. If that's the case, then they're probably close to each other, because the caps in New Mystery are pretty high in some classes, like Swordmaster classes like 30. But if you're just doing Draco Knight duty, for example, your speed cap's like 23 or something. And in that case, like the difference in Catria and Luke's stats is kind of evaporated. But again, it depends on what kind of class you put them in. And I think Luke and Catria both cap important stats for endgame anyway. So they'd probably be fairly close, maybe closer than this. Maybe it'd be more like an 8 for both, would be more accurate. But yeah, Catria is just really good throughout the game. There's not really a chapter where she's bad. Like, there's some characters that might be like bad in one chapter, like the desert chapter or something, where they can't move around a whole lot, and so either they can reclass into a flyer, or if that makes them bad, then they just get benched, or they just aren't very good. New Mystery is kind of equal like that. Like, because everyone can reclass into something, there's not really a map that's where someone is bad. I think I showed like Marcus on the FE7 skill, for example. In the desert chapter, he's just kind of, his rating kind of plummets for a map. Or maybe there's like a chapter with a low deployment limit or a lot of water, you know, enemies that are very hostile to you. But FE12 doesn't really have that. Like, you just kind of adjust to whatever is in front of you in preps and go from there, which is why these look very flat. Maybe there's a different character that will look different, but I expect a lot of characters will kind of look like this in FE12. Which, again, it's not an observation I would have made just from doing a tier list maker. So that's the added value of unit stonks for me, is seeing things like this, like, oh, that's a cool way, that's a weird way that everyone kind of does that. Why is everyone's line like that? And I think about it, it's like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. That's kind of cool. I can't really explain why. It's kind of a nerdy thing, but I like it. Let's go to Awakening next. Hey, did you guys know you can center a source in OBS so that it like actually is in the middle of the screen? I certainly didn't. Or I did, but I forgot. Anyway, you can see my own submission of Robin here from a long time ago. You can ignore that. That one's already there. Or maybe it wasn't. Anyway, I don't think I have to explain it very much. Robin is good early on, but he just becomes the best unit ever in the history of the game. So that's why he gets a 10 all around. And then we have Chrom. I think Chrom, I actually asked Lunatic Plus expert and honestly self-torture kind of person, Casey, like, hey, is this an accurate thing for Chrom? They were like, yeah, that's roughly accurate if you take into account lower difficulties. Like on Lunatic Plus, Chrom would be a little lower than this, but if you take into account lower difficulties, this is probably roughly okay. Because Chrom starts out fine. He's one of those characters that isn't like, it doesn't really matter what difficulty you're on. They're not Frederick, but they're okay. Other than that, like, they don't get one-on by everything, but there's probably enemies that still threaten them a lot, so you want to be a bit careful when you use them. But for example, when I paired up Chrom and Frederick, and I just had them fight in the early chapters of Hard, they crushed everything because Frederick's pair up bonuses turn everyone into an invincible, you know, super fighting robot. And so it's pretty good. And then Chrom just kind of, it's kind of an okay unit throughout the whole game. I don't think there's anything particularly weird about Chrom. There's some chapters where he's like a little bit better than maybe this. Like maybe you could give him like in chapter 5, you can give him an 8 because the Falcon is affected against Wyverns. Stuff like that you could do. There's a couple more chapters where Wyverns show up, where he's kind of okay like that. But other than that, like, what is Chrom really besides somewhat generic swordsman? I know I sound like a Smash player, but somewhat generic swords dude that eventually can promote into, I think it can reclass / promote into the Cavalier line, which is a good class line to have, both for skills and general mobility, so that's pretty good. But they don't really stand out enough to be like a super carry. I don't think he has easy access to like Nosferatu tanking or any broken strategy like that. He's not as super busted as Robin is with like Veteran and everything else that comes along with it. So a 7 seems about right. I think someone like, I don't know, who else is even better than Chrom? Trying to think, because like besides Robin, like Frederick, I guess Frederick is a better unit than Chrom for the early game, and probably overall, considering how hard early game is, he's probably better. On that, not that many characters, but he doesn't stand out a whole lot to me. He just seems like the same-ish throughout the whole game. He doesn't have a singular chapter where he promotes, but if you assume that like everyone promotes around like chapter 10 or chapter 14 or something, it's the same thing as with Luke earlier. He probably just promotes along with everyone else, maybe a little bit earlier because he's better in the early game, doesn't have to catch up or anything. The one standout thing about Chrom that I find funny is that in the end game, it's easiest to fight Grima when you have someone dual striking with the Falchion to pierce Dragon Skin, have effective damage, etc, etc. And it turns out Chrom is dual strike plus, just from his class. I think at base he just starts with it, and he's the best candidate for doing this. The other person to do it would be Lucina, but I still think it's fair to credit Chrom for it a little bit. Especially because building up Chrom, Robin's support throughout the whole game is one of the easiest strategies to do in the first place. So that's pretty good. By the way, I've just been assuming that you just use Chrom like an actual combat unit throughout Awakening. If you're just doing a Robin solo, pairing Chrom into him is obviously a good idea. And there are some points where he would actually have to do work a little bit, like against Grima, but not that many. So his rating will probably be lower in the end. He's like a necessary backpack for Robin just because you have to hide Chrom somewhere. It's easier to do that behind Robin than somewhere on the field. But I wouldn't really give a whole lot of credit for that. Like, this is actually Chrom as a unit. That's how I see him. Anyway, now that we've done that, let's move on to Conquest. Alright, so Conquest, Modi, or I guess I typed it as Mozi, gave me a unit called Modu to rate in Conquest. Gave me quite a difficult one for two reasons. One, Mozu is a paralog unit, so you can technically recruit her at multiple points. In Mozu's case, it doesn't really change a whole lot because there's no reason not to do her paralog ASAP, especially if you plan on using her. You really want to train her ASAP, so that doesn't really matter that much. The other part is it's not a unit that has a bit of a power spike going on that's tough to place exactly. Of course, Mozu starts as a villager and is best off reclassed to an archer to gain access to good skills and generally have better stats, being able to attack from range, use like a forged bow instead of, you know, I guess a lance wouldn't be terrible either, but the bow seems more convenient to me. So I just kind of assumed that she joins around chapter 8, and I didn't really want to put a paralog in this because paralogs are weird and can generally be timed anywhere. I generally try to leave those out of these tier lists, and so we ended up with this. I left off 15 because, you know, chapter 15 is only for Khorne, Azura, and Gunter, so that's why there's a gap there. You'll see that in pretty much every other Conquest rating in the future as well. So how does Mozu generally work? I feel like at some point she'd pop off. I'm just not sure exactly when. I've never used Mozu for the entire game. I've used her in Birthright, though, where she was quite good until I started Rioma soloing. So I know roughly how she turned out. I know Quick Draw is a very strong ability that she gets just to do, like, massive extra damage. Or it's basically death blow for archers. I kind of like it, actually. So I gave her like semi-high ratings, assuming you give her the heart seal. Now, opportunity cost for resource uses, like I said before, has never been great for unit stonks because you don't really... It's not really a singular chapter where you become worse or better. It's just a general cost that affects you in multiple ways. You don't get that many heart seals in Conquest. I think you get one from Haitaka from chapter 9, and then one before that from the shop. And that one can go to a bunch of different units. I've really enjoyed having it on Jacob, for instance, but it's a pretty contested resource. Khorne herself also makes great use of it, or Khorne himself makes great use of it as well, to go into the exact class that you gave him as a talent. So it's not contested, but at the same time, Mozu is a pretty good user of it, so I'm not sure how to evaluate it. And in the end, of course, Mozu also just doesn't have very good bases, but good enough to function if you plan out everything well. I do think Mozu is like not great as like an easy go bunga unit. Someone like early game Jacob with Khorne marriage and everything, Camilla, Xander, etc. Those units I think are like a far step above what Mozu can ever accomplish. Mozu is more of a unit that you gotta, you know, if you plan out every move you have, then she turns out pretty well. And you can work around all her problems, but if you don't, if you're a dumbass like me, then she's not as great. So definitely rewards planning a lot, in the same way the dancers do, but I think a little bit more difficult too, because even a mediocre player like me can use a dancer to like at least some effect. But mostly if you're not willing to slow down for her, I don't know how much she really does for you. So I went with like roughly a 6 or a 7. I've always said that the 3 days emblems are my weak spot, especially when it comes to units I haven't used, like, because of my latest Conquest playthrough. I'm a lot more knowledgeable at Conquest than I used to be, but there's still units I just kind of draw a blank on. So this is my estimation based on what I've seen other people do with her. I know technically it's possible for example, 0% Mozu to kill the endgame boss, but all that requires funny stat stacking to an extent that I don't think is feasible for general unit discussion. But just know, I know what's possible with Mozu, and the only question I think is, how much do you weigh what you need to make her good against her? Be it the use of the Heart Seal, babying her, and generally planning out your moves in such a way that Mozu doesn't end up getting killed and still ends up getting a lot of kills. That's my estimation of Mozu. Pretty hard unit to rate, honestly, especially with little experience using her. Next up is Shadows of Valentia, and this I had to make a whole different kind of overview for, because Shadows of Valentia doesn't have a great chapter numbering system. It's just Act 1, Act 3, Act 4, Act 5, and then Act 2 is Celica, of course. And they don't really have, I guess they have names for those battles, but they're pretty hard to remember, and the battles not very distinct from one another. Some maps are shared. And so I came up with my own little titles for them and my own little numbering system for them, as you can see over here. Let me fit it on screen better so you guys can see it properly. There you go, that makes a bit more sense, does it? So Bees submitted Luthier and Pilada submitted Alm, and then also we have Modern Mind's submission of Celica for the next page, but I'll crop that afterwards. So I made up my own little numbering system for these chapters, even though they're not called that. They're called like, some people call them like Act 1, Chapter 1, which is just Alm and the villagers, the Ram boys, just fighting a bunch of bandits, stuff like that. So that's why I have these little titles in here so you guys can see what battle I'm actually talking about, because I don't think a lot of people say like 3-5 or stuff like that, even though I know that 3-5 means the Cavalier battle. It can be pretty tricky to remember, right? So Luthier is pretty easy because, you know, he's not around for Act 1 or half of Act 3. He joins for the Sade Fort, basically. He like visits this village, you get him, and then you go to the Sade Fort. That's pretty much how it goes. And I think that's his best map. And it's still only a 7. I'm kind of down on Luthier lately. I think he has his uses, particularly when you have strong armored enemies that you want to cut through. Using Excalibur to like try and get a crit on them tends to be his best, most efficient usage. Other than that, I find him pretty tricky to use because his durability is kind of bad, and on top of that, he loses HP every time he attacks. And, you know, avoiding counters is nice on player phase, but a lot of enemies are grouped in such a way that you also want to be able to fight them on enemy phase. And if you have a unit that can tackle them on enemy phase, like, say, an Armor Knight, they usually just kind of manage to destroy the whole group by themselves, and the question is why even involve Luthier. So Luthier is best in a map with a choke point that he can hide behind. He can hide behind a bulker unit, and he can just fire Excaliburs at armored enemies, such as the Sade Fort. And even there, I find it really... it's still kind of tricky to keep him alive, especially when you're fighting like the Say, who has a Javelin. Luthier like almost dies if he doesn't crit the Say, and then you have to like get him out of there or heal him, and it just ends up clogging up the whole thing. And that's his best map. So I'm not super high on Luthier. That's why I started as a 7 in that chapter, and everything else is like a 3 or a 4 or a 5, roughly speaking, because I'm trying to think of like scenarios where he's useful. The thing is, I think he gets like Thunder as like a 3-range spell, but he doesn't counter with it. And a lot of enemies have 4 or even 5 range, and he can't counter those. He's not exactly good against Arcanists, for example, like his fellow mages, because his res isn't very good, and their res is above average, so he's still not very good at exchanging blows with those. There's no reason not to use like a bow user instead for those, for example. So, just not a big fan of Luthier's utility over the game overall. I can't really find a battle where he's good. There's a couple that I kind of like Fear Mountain Witches. That chapter has a couple of Barons that he can again be reasonably useful against. But you still have to be very careful with him, because if you like fight one Baron, and there's usually like 4 or 5 in a group, right? You can kill one of them with Luthier, maybe with a crit, and then you have to kill the other 4 or 5, or Luthier is about to get wrecked. Like maybe he'll survive one after that. Let's say he didn't get countered by the first one that he killed, and then another one attacks him. Then he's fine, and then if another one attacks him, he's kind of dead, I believe. That's roughly the way he goes. Or at least he risks death, right? So he still needs help in doing that, and if that other person that helps him is like competent at wiping them out completely, then again Luthier is very questionable. Fortunately, in that case, there's not really that many characters that can really help out to that extent, so usually if it's a group effort, then it's fine for Luthier not to be able to handle them on his own. But he's still like a piece of the puzzle rather than someone that just takes care of a problem all by themselves. So yeah, that's why I have Luthier only at a 5, even in a map where he's reasonably good. But like if you're fighting like a ton of enemy Cavaliers, then why would you ever have Luthier do anything? Seems pretty suboptimal. Like, even if you're playing slowly, I just don't find it very appealing to try and use Luthier in these battles. I've tried something funkies, like I tried like funky strategies, like giving him the Draco Shield and then having him fight a bunch of these guys in enemy phase. But even with the Draco Shield, he can end up dying somehow. It's quite impressive, honestly, because he gets doubled and he doesn't take 1 damage. He takes like multiple points of damage, and he still loses HP from using spells. So even with that, he's not invulnerable. So yeah, his unit feel is not very good. Let's just put it that way. Alm, on the other hand, is quite a different beast. He is around for the entire game as far as Alm's acts are concerned. And I mean, if you follow the graph, you can see he starts off really good, falls off slowly, and then goes back up. That's basically the way I describe Alm. This little pit right here is basically Act 3, where Alm is not very good. But in Act 1, I like to think of him as a bit of a Jagan. I like that Alm doesn't need experience to be good in Act 4 because his promotion is automatic. He doesn't need a high level for it, and the class bases are so good that it's kind of a waste of experience to train him. So that's why he has a really high rating for Act 4. We discussed this in depth in the Shadows of Valentia unit guide, or the unit guide. I mean that one too, the character guide, but also in the SOV tier list revision that I did with Peeved. Like, we ended up putting Alm, I think, A- tier, which is pretty good. Even though we both thought he was pretty bad in Act 3, and I still gave him like reasonable-ish ratings, I think, maybe even generous ones. Generous? That's generic. Generous ratings. But in Act 1, like, I just gave him good ratings because he doesn't need EXP, but he can still make use of it a bit if you want. Like, having a couple points of strength or speed on Alm is never a bad thing or anything early on. And then, like, who's even better than Alm early on? Like, Lucas, I guess, but I still consider them roughly tied. Like, he has an extra point of movement over the guy. He doubles just about everything. Like, what more do you want from a unit, right? And then slowly, as more units start like doing things, he falls off a bit. I think whoever villager you make into a mercenary is generally going to be better than Alm, especially when it comes to using the lightning sword. So, especially in this map, for example, the Calves and Soldiers map early on in Act 1, that one almost not even close to your best unit anymore. You could still see him as like an 8 or a 9 probably if you wanted to. But I think the mercenary is better by so much that it's fine to bump Alm down a little bit more. But I still have like a 9 or an 8 until that point happens. And then, like, for example, Alm versus a villager mage is, I think, favored for the mage, but not by a whole lot, depending on the map. And versus like a villager archer or a villager cavalier, if you're doing that, he's still better overall, I think. But it really depends on what else you got. And compared to someone like Faye or Silk, I think both of those are better than Alm, generally speaking. If not in Act 1, then definitely in Act 3. And Act 4, Alm promotes. He's really good. He can use the killer bow at range. He doesn't have as much range as a bow knight, but he still has, I believe, 3 range. So that's good enough to fight arcanists. Still good enough to like snipe for kills, not take counters, etc., etc., etc. Still gives him 1 to 3 range, basically. It's still pretty good. Or if you're someone who prefers the regal sword kind of thing, I personally don't. But if you think that's better, then you know that doesn't change the rating a whole lot, does it? It still makes him really good for these. I also think he's the best unit for the final and one of the best units for Berkeley Renea. Fight. These are the only battles you have to do in Act 5. I guess I should mention also, I didn't really put like dungeons in here, like dungeon encounters. Generally, those are fights where you're fighting enemies that you're probably already fighting somewhere else too, so they shouldn't impact the ratings too much. Like, for example, in Act 1, the Thief Shrine is not in here, but you're fighting bandits, so if you're good here, you're probably good against those as well. If you're fighting reinforcements from the Save Fort, they're Cavalier, so you're pretty much fighting similar enemies as like the Cavalier Deluge from the chapter afterwards. Stuff like that. I didn't put that in separately because honestly this game has plenty of entries already for a nice looking graph. But yeah, I mean, this is one where I don't think the chart doesn't really do anything besides visualize what we already know, as opposed to the visualization bringing us to like a new conclusion, because I already knew, like, I liked Alm in Act 1, I did like him in Act 3, and I like him again after Act 4, and he promotes. Like, I already knew that. So it's basically just putting what I already knew in a different shape, which is fun, but it's not as intriguing as, for example, the realizations I came to earlier, when I realized that, you know, there's not actually that many chapters in Thracia where a thief is very useful, or what I said earlier about, I don't know, there was something else, about the FE12 lines being very flat, like they're just kind of a slope going one way. There's just a bunch of 7s. Never really thought about how Luke and Catria don't change much throughout the whole of FE12, even though they obviously change with growths and promotions and everything. Relatively speaking, not much changes. So that I think was more interesting than these. But hey, at least I had fun making colored titles for the chapters. Let's move on to Celica. So Celica is a little bit more straightforward because there's only one character here, Modern Mind Submission to Celica, and Joshua, but I couldn't find any data on Joshua from SOV. So Celica is weird in Act 2 early on because you get so few units that it becomes kind of difficult to really make up a proper rating for them. So I just kind of went with my gut. As long as you only have like Celica, May, Bowie, and Jenny, like what are you supposed to give her for ratings, right? So for the first couple chapters, not a whole lot to say here. They get Saber. Celica's not, like, I think Saber's better than Celica, so every chapter that Saber's around, he's a bit better than Celica, so Celica gets a bit worse by comparison. I'm not even sure if Celica's definitely the better character between her and Bowie and May. Their stats are pretty close overall early on, especially if you give them fountains to make up for the differences. I actually did a playthrough of SOV recently, where I tried to carry with Celica, and for the most part, I wasn't super impressed with her compared to how I usually use her, which is like a couple levels, enough levels to be good against Necro Dragons with Seraphim when you arrived at that Sea Shrine. Everything else she was kind of okay. The only battle where she really sticks out, I think, is the Jeddah battle, and to a lesser extent maybe Duma Gate, but even that, she wasn't very good there. But against Jeddah, she's actually one of the better characters at like either negating his shield, like getting attacks in with the majoring while he doesn't counter you, or being the person to actually kill him with, I think she uses Ragnarok for a bunch of damage. I think she can like either one kill him with a crit or kill him with a crit plus hit, depending on her stats. And that's pretty impressive. It's not super necessary if you're playing that battle normally, because you can just kill the eyeball and he'll eventually leave. But if you're playing fast, then this is something you want to do, and that's something she's really good at. Other than that, Celica is just a really good mage with generally good stats. I don't think her promotion even does a whole lot for her. I think it resets her level, might even increase her XP gain a bit, but it doesn't gain her a bunch of stats as far as I recall. But I think she's generally a unit that contributes but doesn't carry the whole battle. Someone who does like that is like Saber or Leon, or even Pala or Catria if you're raising them. But Celica is more of a supportive kind of character that, you know, if you've given him a bunch of XP, it's just like May and Bowie, you can send them to a couple of enemies and kill them, but eventually they'll run out of HP. Celica fortunately does counter with a sword rather than tomes like May and Bowie, so sometimes that can help in preserving her HP. I think if you get a bit lucky with Celica, she can reach one round kill thresholds. I think I've almost reached them with some battles, but not quite. She needs like the stronger weapon. Yeah, I think I like a steel sword. She can one round kill pirates sometimes, for example, which is kind of nice. So it's a bit dependent on like which fountains you give her and which stats. But I think in order for her to be this good, like these high ratings, you do need to like really feed her almost all the XP you get early on in Act 2. Or it doesn't really work. Like if you're just using her as a bit of a flunky and you're spreading her XP evenly, or you're investing heavily into either Bowie or May or even Jenny or even Saber, then it looks a little bit different. But I think Celica is overall serviceable, but as you can see later in the game, she definitely doesn't have great lasting performance. Like once you get to the swamps and everything, she just doesn't do a whole lot just by virtue of low movements. She can heal, but I don't think she heals adjacent automatically like the priestesses do. So that makes her unit feel a bit worse in particular. Like at least if you put someone next to Jenny, they'll heal themselves out the swamp damage, stuff like that. She also doesn't have physic, so she can't support from range like Jenny can. So she's not even the most important healer. Like she's only working like that if you have Pala like go in, fight enemies, and then fly back and get healed or something. It's just not really something you want to do at any rate. So I think Celica overall, kind of nice. Like A- is like generous for her in hindsight, I think, for a tier list ranking, but it really depends on how you view the investment costs of having her be your carry and how badly you think it hurts her that she's like forced into a certain deployment slot. Because if you don't care about that, then she's honestly about as good as Jenny and Bowie are. Definitely is about, or Jenny and Bowie, mostly May and Bowie, not Jenny. Jenny's different. But yeah, pretty good early on. Then kind of falls off, and then at the end, some relevance again. I don't think she's very good at final, but she can like Seraphim some monsters, which is kind of nice. We have 3 houses left. So for 3 houses, that's like the least straightforward game when it comes to rating units because everyone is so customizable. So I took a bit of a different approach for this one. I made it class-based, and not just class-based, but I said, okay, how good are these units in their beginner and intermediate classes, etc., roughly compared to everyone else? And that way, instead of going chapter by chapter and exactly based on, have to like make assumptions about who gets what resource when, you instead just talk about how good are they at this stage in their career, roughly speaking. Of course, it still depends a bit on the chapters. For that reason, I made a chapter-based one as well that I'll show in a minute. But just to give you an idea of like a different way to approach this than just chapter by chapter, which I think at least is fun to explore. So Carasso submitted Dudu, Blue Caeda submitted Dorothea and Linhardt. So I made a noble part because I forgot what it's called when they're like either a noble or a commoner, so I just went with noob, and then I realized noob is kind of spelled like noble, so let's make a funny out of it. Then I went with beginner, intermediate, etc. So let's start with the do. The do is blue lines only, but for this discussion it doesn't really matter a whole lot. I think the do is early game is very, very good, so that's why he has like these two 10s right here, and even as an intermediate he has a 9, because when you think about it, do is your bulkiest unit in the blue lines by far, and bulk is hard to find in the early game of 3 houses manning, which is what I'm basing myself on right now. And, you know, just being able to walk up to someone, press wait, get +4 defense, and just bait a bunch of enemies is nice. And then when a strategy no longer becomes viable, personally I didn't find it to do super useful for my blue lines experiences, because I could generally make do with like Felix and Dimitri. Fortunately, he has an offensive side to him as well. He gets vengeance around the same time that Bernadetta does, so if you really focus on lances, you can get it by chapter 4 or chapter 5 at the latest. And vengeance is very, very powerful, and you don't have to get the +4 defense bonus with the do, and that makes it easier to like weaken him to the point where you can kill things with vengeance. And he has more strength than Bernadetta as well, so he can vengeance nuke people. The problem with the do for me comes in when later on, well, first of all, he's not around for a couple chapters, obviously, and he also has a bit of difficulty getting to the classes where vengeance is really good. Paladin, Bow Knights, all the flyer classes, because he has a Bane in riding and a Bane in flying. And I know he does have a thing that people often talk about. He has the lack of a crest, so that means you can hurt him by using something like I don't know, a relic weapon, whereas Bernadetta wouldn't get hurt by those. But I never really found getting hurt to the point where vengeance hurts enemies is really the hard part of using the do, or Bernadetta, like just put him in range of an enemy and they'll get weakened enough to kill things. So I don't really rate that part really highly. What I do like about Vengeance builds is being available in Chapter 7, which we'll get into in a minute. That's the big problem with Cyril, in my opinion, when it comes to Vengeance builds. Not being around for the ground or field battle, where Vengeance has the biggest impact because the enemies are so strong there. But anyway, that's why I think the do falls off a bit, but generally has a really strong early game and kind of loses from there. I guess the big drawback to this approach is you're really back to generalizing a bit more about all the chapters, kind of like a tier list does, except you still like splitting it up into like 5 different sections, but you're still talking in terms of like early game, mid game, late game, which I think is what we're not trying to avoid, but we're trying to make a bit more detail here. But let me know what you think of this approach, because for the rest of these, it's kind of not the same story as the do, but kind of the same early, mid, late divide I'm talking about. Dorothea, I think, is generally, I mostly use her in the early game for her supportive skills, so like her personal, where she heals people that are like near her. I think it's either within 2 tiles or next to her, I forgot exactly which, but the point is, if you're playing very slowly, you can heal your characters without using up vulneraries or heals, so that's kind of nice. And then in addition, Dorothea generally just provides good chip damage early on with, I think she has Thunder. I don't think really want to use swords very often, so it's generally just run out of Thunder uses and then she's kind of done. But she gets more spells later on, like Thoron. Physic is very helpful. Physic support in the mid-game especially is just kind of nice. But I don't find that Dorothea doubles a whole lot and doesn't have very good bulk, so as the game goes on, I generally don't find her magical abilities very helpful. So generally, I've been like a bit generous, I think, with the ratings. I'm trying to give people not failing grades, basically, unless they're like really, really bad. Because, you know, I want to give Dorothea like a really bad rating, because but at the same time, when you post time skip and there's like 5 enemies to your 1 player unit and you can chip one of them, how helpful is that really offensively? Like generally you don't double a whole lot besides Armor Knights, and you know, doubling Armor Knights isn't even that difficult, nor are they hard to kill when you've got like effective weapons at your disposal. So I generally don't rate the magical capabilities very highly, and Dorothea doesn't have any noteworthy staff utility, I don't believe, besides Physic. The one thing I will mention about Dorothea that's very nice is Rally Charm, which I think is mostly useful in the early chapters where you can make someone's gambits a lot more accurate. Enemies in Maddening have a lot more charm besides demonic beasts, so being able to bridge that gap with her Rally Charm is very nice. You can get I think you get 100 hit on gambits using Rally Charm, which is quite unheard of. Linhardt is a bit better in that regard. You can see he starts out with 7s too, for the same healing abilities. I mean, he doesn't have the personal, but he does have Physic. I think a bit earlier than Dorothea, because Dorothea has to get through her Bane first with the hidden talent and go from there. Linhardt also gets Warp, which I think works very well regardless of playstyle. Like, people associate it with LTC, but you can use it for positioning very, very well. And it gets refreshed after every chapter, so you don't have to hoard it even. So if you just need a unit on like anywhere else, you can warp them. It's very helpful. Like, and in a way, he enables units like the Do to be in more places at once than if they like ignoring the fact that they don't have a mount. Like, you still get them across the map fast thanks to Linhardt's support. So I think that's very helpful. So even though Linhardt doesn't do a whole lot with this offensive magic past like the early mid game, having warp is still very helpful. Having physics support is helpful. Generally, another good way to think of it with Linhardt, in my opinion, is if you're playing every map, if you're engaging with every map, if you're playing it slowly, if you're just chilling, you're just trying to get through, maybe you're not like dawdling, or like maybe you're playing somewhat efficiently, you might not like warp skip every map, but in that case you're probably going to get utility out of physics, just healing people. Whereas if you are playing very fast, then warp is very, very helpful. So no matter what, I think you end up having to give a high rating to Linhardt. Let me show the chapter by chapter analysis, because that one might give a bit of better idea what I'm talking about here. So this is the chapter by chapter analysis. You can see the Do's high ratings basically just last throughout the entire start of the game. I think he falls off a bit towards chapter 5 and chapter 6, not because he's bad, like that's when he gets vengeance. But in chapter 5, I was like, okay, maybe in this one he's more like a 9. But in chapter 6, there's no Dimitri, so there's less competition for being really, really good. So I'm going to give him a 10 again and slowly drop him off from here. He's not around for this part of the game here. Kind of like the same portion that Dimitri is unavailable for tutoring, I believe. Not a coincidence, obviously. But yeah, he's not there for Hunting by Daybreak, which is unfortunate, and for a couple chapters after that. I don't find the Do very helpful post-time skip. He has a 3 here because he joins like where you could be done with the bridge map, basically, so I really don't want to rate his contributions higher than a 3 there. You can still make him useful if you play slower, of course, but I gotta penalize him in some way. And then the thing with the Do is, like, I think his combat is fine for post-time skip. You can make him into like a lot of different classes that have offensive capabilities. He has Battalion Wrath, I believe. He can use Vengeance, he can use Fierce Iron Fist. All these different builds work for him. But the problem is, to what end are you going to use it? Does he really stand out in the one thing you need to efficiently clear maps post-time skip, which is just killing bosses? Pretty much every post-time skip map is kill boss. And the Do is not the best boss killer ever. He's okay at it, sure, he can kill like Cornelia probably. But how much does he really stand out in that way? Not a whole lot. If you're playing him a bit slower, I can see his rating go up a little bit. But even then, who does he look good compared to? He's definitely not as good as the units that you're probably carrying with, like Byleth or Dimitri. He's probably better at fighting than Dorothea and Linhardt, which is why he has a higher rating than Dorothea. But Linhardt is warped, so I think he still stands out in this way. And then, I don't know, is he better than Felix? I don't think so. I feel like Felix is a bit better still. Maybe not, but it's been a while since I've actually done like statistical comparisons against like several enemies. But generally at killing bosses, I don't think the Do stands out a whole lot. Especially because like Vengeance is not very practical for it. But Fierce Iron Fist can probably make the job done, or get the job done. But then Dorothea, like I said, good healing utility early on that slowly falls off a bit, and by the time skip hits, there's just not much for her to do. I believe that's very important. I'm sure you can get some utility out of her if you try to force it, but I don't think it's necessary. There's probably some way to make her like have her help you increase reliability or something like that. This little dip in 3 is because this is Hunting by Daybreak, and in that chapter I really think she can't do anything besides hiding in a corner, waiting for other units to solve the map for you. And then Linhardt, I kind of went over Warp already. I think it's good in every point of the game that you have it. And before he has Warp, that's pretty much when his support shines through with heal and physic. You have limited healing early on. It's nice to give people a heal so they can spend their turn doing something else. Or maybe even you have to like heal them and use a vulnerary with them. So healing is very, very good. And the fact that the limit uses, like, it sucks that you can't do it more often, but every single time you get to use it, it's very good. So I don't really want to penalize him too hard for having limited uses of heal and physic. And at any rate, it's good that he has more than like someone like Mercedes, for example, in that regard. I will say one last thing about the route split. Obviously, the Do is raised based on his Blue Lions performance because it's the only route he's available in. For Dorothea and Linhardt, I don't think it makes a big difference which route you put them in. I don't think they're particularly better in, for example, the Golden Deer or Verdant Wind, I guess is what we should call it, because when the maps really start to differ. Pre-time skip, obviously everything is roughly the same, but post-time skip, there are some minor differences between the time skip, but I really don't think it matters. I just kind of assumed they're home houses, so Crimson Flower for this, and then added on the Silver Snow chapters at the end, I guess. But I don't think it makes a big difference. Like, obviously they're all 8s here and all 4s here, because I really think their utility in every chapter is kind of similar. For Linhardt, it's one big warp and maybe some healing support. And for the Dorothea, it's sitting there I guess Dancer utility is one more thing I could mention for Dorothea. If you're a Dancer, obviously your rating shoots high up, but am I really going to give units a higher rating for being good Dancer candidates? If anything, Dorothea is a good Dancer candidate because her ability to do anything else is pretty diminished at this point. So the fact that this looks like this is a reason why you give her a resource like the Dancer class, but at the same time, anyone can do what she can do in Dancer class. I think the Meteor support actually is something that maybe, yeah, that's something I should probably factor in a little bit more. The fact that she supports people with a linked attack on Meteor. That's about it though. It's pretty minor still, but it might bump her up to a 5 or so. I don't know, let me know what you think. Yeah, that's it. Just a chill video. It's been a while since I did a solo video, but here you go. There's some unit stonks for you. Hope you enjoyed it. Again, sorry for the wait. I hope it didn't make it any worse for you. And if I ever do one of these again, I'll definitely make it into 3 videos in one series without like a 2-month pause. I'll see you around, and goodbye.